matters.
I see. And how would you respond if you find out who did this?
Obviously, the President of the United States has spoken on that subject, and those are issues that he will address in good time.
Mr.
Yes.
Secretary, we are getting reports from CNN and others that there are bombs exploding in Kabul, Afghanistan. Are we at the moment striking back, and if so, is the target Osama bin Laden and his organization?
I've seen those reports. They, in no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
A show of bipartisan support and solidarity at the Pentagon with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld orchestrating this bipartisan appearance by members of Congress and General Hugh Shelton, the chairman of the Military Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. That'll go on for a bit, but the Secretary of Defense never noted for talking a lot on this crisis circumstances, making it clear he wasn't going to say a lot about what's going on. President Bush condemned the terrorist attacks. He vowed to bring those responsible to justice when it is determined who did it. The president is now back in Washington, headed at last report for the White House itself. He intends to address the nation from Washington this evening. We expect that at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. That'd be 8 Central, and of course 6 p.m. On the West Coast. CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts has the latest. John?
Dan, even as the president makes his way back to the White House, the administration is still trying to come to grips with the scope of this tragedy. Secret Service sources tell CBS News that this indeed was just like Pearl Harbor. There was nothing on their threat assessment, no warning that this was coming.
The president was in Florida when word of the attacks first broke. Reading with a group of elementary students, Mr. Bush was stopped cold when his chief of staff delivered the news.
Move everybody across the street.
Moments later, in Washington, an urgent call to evacuate the White House.
I'm told that a plane went into the Pentagon and they're chasing us off the grounds here.
It was an extraordinary scene as staff and the press corps were rushed from the grounds. If the Pentagon had been targeted, the Secret Service feared the president's home could be next.
Get everybody back. Everybody back.
Fire trucks took up positions on Pennsylvania Avenue, while SWAT teams stood vigil from the roof. Police sealed off a 2-block area around the White House. The only ones left inside the mansion, the vice president and his national security team, coordinating a response to the crisis from the Situation Room. With a continuing threat in Washington, the Secret Service would not allow the president to return and had him fly immediately to the security of Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward.
The full scope of the tragedy now apparent, Mr. Bush addressed the nation and vowed these acts of terrorism will not stand.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
From Barksdale, the president headed for Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, home of the Strategic Air Command, where he conferred with his national security staff about how to proceed. Confident that the White House had been secured, he then headed back for Washington, determined to send a signal to the world that America would stand strong in the face of these horrible acts.
And Dan, some more tough talk tonight from the president ahead of his address to the nation. A report just filed from aboard Air Force One. His spokesman, quoting the president, is saying, "We will find these people and they will suffer the consequences of taking on this nation. We will do what it takes. No one is going to diminish the spirit of this nation." Dan?
John Roberts in Washington Live. John, what's the security situation at the White House at this moment?
Well, Dan, the White House is still locked down. We are not allowed back in. There is a small crew that's been allowed back in to tape the president live tonight at 9 o'clock. You can see the helicopters are just starting to arrive on the south lawn of the White House. Dan, as a security precaution, Air Force One, which is always shadowed by fighter jets wherever it travels, was more than shadowed today. On its way back from Nebraska, there was an F-15 positioned on each wing. And even now, Dan, every once in a while, we hear a fighter jet flying combat air patrol, if you will, over Washington, D.C., something this nation never thought they would see happen. Again, the president just now arriving back at the White House. We'll hear from him later on tonight.
At 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Thanks, John Roberts. One of the few things that seems certain tonight is that these hijackings and attacks were meticulously planned and carried out with great precision. It also took a lot of money to do it. All of that is strongly supported by hard facts now at hand. CBS News correspondent Bob Orr, who covers aviation for us, has pieced it together. Bob?
Well, Dan, there's no doubt at all it was a highly coordinated attack, launched with simultaneous breaches of security at three of the nation's busiest airports this morning. Under the cover of the hectic morning rush hour, when airports are particularly vulnerable, hijackers boarded 4 large passenger jets, 2 each from American Airlines and United Airlines, 2 of the strongest symbols of U.S. aviation.
American Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off first at 7:45 this morning from Boston bound for Los Angeles. 13 minutes later, another 767, United Flight 175, also left Boston for L.A. At virtually the same moment, United Flight 93, a 757, took off from Newark for San Francisco. And to the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still 2 hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the fourth plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the 4-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here.
285 people died aboard the airliners today. And tonight, the FAA is at a loss to explain how the security failures happened this morning. Now, you should know that numerous investigations have revealed gaping holes in this nation's aviation security system. But an important point to remember, and as I continue here, you see the President arriving in Marine One on the south lawn of the White House. It's important to remember that these were suicide attacks this morning, long acknowledged worldwide as the very hardest to stop. There is no piece of equipment, no scanner, no screener that absolutely can stop a terrorist who is willing to die. Dan?
Bob Orr live in Washington, just as you see a live photograph of President Bush stepping off Marine One, the helicopter that brought him from Andrews Air Force Base, where Air Force One took him a few moments ago. A salute to the Marine Guard, and a naturally somber-faced president strides in past the beautiful Rose Garden into the White House and into the Oval Office. The President will be addressing the nation tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. That'll be 8 Central, 6 on the far west coast. President Bush has spoken twice today. On both occasions, among other things, he asked for prayers for the families of victims of today's terrorist attacks. Now, Bob Orr, as we have only actually about a minute left in this particular section, but our CBS News coverage will continue, of course. There was this report from Barbara Olson, the wife of the U.S. Solicitor General, who by telephone from the hijacked plane that eventually hit the Pentagon described some of the hijackers as having knife-like equipment. What's that all about?
Well, Dan, I think it could be critical in understanding how the security was breached. Remember, at airport checkpoints, there are 2 main pieces of equipment. There are X-ray machines. They are designed exclusively to look for the shape of a gun. That's the weapon that aviation experts fear. Also, there are magnetometers, metal detectors, and they are designed to pick up any metal, also a gun. But imagine for a moment, we heard apparently that Barbara Olson radioed they were using knife-like devices. What if these were made of some other hard material, some kind of plastic? What if they were disguised as fountain pens or secured somewhere on the body of the person or within a briefcase? They would not automatically set off the kind of alarm bells that a gun would set off. And in order for these attacks to have been promulgated simultaneously, it might go a long way to explain how they were able to breach the system 3 different places at once. Dan?
Bob Orr in Washington. Now you're watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Back now with our special CBS Evening News live coverage of the attack on America from CBS News World Headquarters in New York. It began just before 9 a.m. in New York City rush hour. First, one of the twin towers of the 110-story World Trade Center was hit by a hijacked jetliner. Then the other suffered the same fate. A huge fireball blew all the way through the South Tower. You may want to watch here as the second plane hits. Minutes later, near Washington, a similar attack, a hijacked airliner attack on the Pentagon. A third jetliner crashed near the U.S. military headquarters, setting it aflame. And then in western Pennsylvania, not far from the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland, but in southwestern Pennsylvania, a fourth hijacked jet went down. Back in New York City, the unimaginable. After burning for more than an hour, the Trade Center towers collapsed. First one, and then the other. Thousands of concrete and steel thundered down in an avalanche on other buildings and into the streets, where firefighters and police were working frantically to help the countless victims. Some of the early victims of this were rescue workers. And then, after fire had raged inside for hours and smoke bellowed through side streets and along the great avenues, yet another major building in the trade complex fell. And tonight, Lower Manhattan, the financial center of the world, lies in ruins. In the nation's capital, a state of emergency and an emergency plan now in effect to keep the federal government running in an orderly way. Congressional leaders were taken to secure locations. The U.S. Capitol complex was evacuated and closed. CBS's Bob Schieffer was among the evacuees. Bob?
Well, Dan, this is something that Washington took very hard, maybe as hard as anything that's ever hit it. First, there was just the shock of seeing those pictures that were coming down from New York, the pictures you've been describing. But second, there was the realization that terrorism for real is for real, and that it could and was happening here. Near panic broke out at the Capitol when rumors spread another airliner was headed there. Pages ran. Senators were understandably perplexed.
Let's get away from the building, ladies and gentlemen.
Nothing like this had ever happened. As police blocked off the area, smoke from the Pentagon miles away could already be seen. Stunned members and aides made their way to the lawn. The Senate chaplain paused to pray.
Gracious Lord, spread a spirit of calm among us.
In a security procedure never before used, the congressional leaders were helicoptered to a secret location. Those who stayed behind could look to the skies and see U.S. fighter planes as they roared past the Capitol.
They had scrambled F-16 fighter aircraft to cope with any potential threat.
Workers were sent home, heavy security went into effect, and police closed off the city of Washington to outsiders.
Okay, you must be a resident of D.C. Emergency personnel or medical to get into the city today.
Parts of the city took on the look of a ghost town. National monuments were blocked off and closed to the public. Information was scarce, but as congressmen emerged from briefings, it was clear a sense of quiet outrage had settled over the national capital.
It's another Pearl Harbor for this country.
We're very vulnerable. I think this is a wake-up call for America, a sobering call.
We send the word out particularly to those who have planned and committed these horrific acts that America is strong, America is principled, America is united.
And Dan, that Washington of yesterday, which was the scene of all that partisan fighting, all that was long ago and far away. This is a different city tonight, a city that is slowly realizing this nation is at war.
Bob Schieffer in Washington. This nation at war.